Great. Well, welcome everyone to SuiteScript Stories. My name is Eric Grubaugh, and I am joined by my lively co-host, Tim Dietrich, today. Doing, Tim?
Thanks for introducing me. You always seem to come up with some interesting adjective for me. I don't think they
Got a
ever
new one for
apply,
you.
but I don't know if I'm lively, but I'm alive. So
Close enough.
yeah, that'll
Uh,
work.
this episode is hosted and sponsored by Salto, but rather than read you some ad copy, I'm actually just going to introduce our special guest. Gil Hoffer is the co-founder and CTO of Salto. So today we'll be talking with him about the benefits and the challenges of DevOps tooling for business platforms like NetSuite. So Gil, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Eric. Tim, thank you for having me.
So I think I want to start off with a little bit about Salto and why it exists. Why
Ooh,
Salto? Why do what you do?
well, that's a long story. But we
You have about
started
1 hour.
Salto. Yeah, so Salto, we started the company 5 years ago, and it's really all about making administrators and developers who work in business and IT applications about making their lives better. That's really the reason to start the company. And we realized that the way that many companies are managing the configurations and customizations and development for these business applications tend to be very tedious, manual, ad hoc. Seems much more like the way that we developed software back in the 90s than the way that we're supposed to do it right now. And it's slowing everyone down. And that's why we started the company, to basically change that and bring modern development and DevOps way of thinking to the way companies manage these business applications. We started with Salesforce, very quickly added NetSuite to it. And then we also added Okta, Zendesk, and Jira, and are actively working on adding quite a few more. I think we'll have a lot of big news in next year with some additional applications. And 5 years in, I'm only more bullish on what we're doing because we're seeing that we're touching so many people and changing the way that they walk in their day-to-day with things that might seem trivial to a software developer in many cases. Sometimes we don't realize how much tooling and thought was put into the stack that we're using in our day-to-day. Being able to use Git, being able to test something before deploy it, being able to not change everything live in production. So those smiles that sometimes we get from our users, they're priceless, really. And these are those smiles that we started the company for.
I see the same. I think 3 years, even 3 years ago, 5 years ago, definitely, I was still like worried about teaching SuiteScript developers Git.
Mm-hmm.
And, nobody at all was talking about unit testing or GitHub Actions or, CI/CD in this space. No one at all was talking about that stuff. And now I see that a lot more, not just from Salto, but in a lot more channels. I'm seeing it a lot more. So I hope the momentum is with you and keeps, we continue building awareness and maturing the space, the processes in this space, because we are so much better at it now than we were in the 90s. So
Yeah.
let's catch up.
And I agreed. And we are seeing that the market is picking up very quickly. If like 4 years ago, as you said, we went into a random NetSuite shop and would say Git, someone would say bless you, basically. But right now, no, most shops are thinking about it. They're doing something, or they would like to do something, and we're there to help them. And over the course of these past few years, we've seen cases where it's really mind-blowing that the way that they were working before they started adopting modern DevOps and development ways. With some of the applications, one of our customers, they were manually managing, it was 27 different production environments, manually repeating and making the same changes over and over again, documenting them in spreadsheets, then scheduling them for off hours and going and clicking the same buttons over and over again. We're not supposed to work like this right now. And the thing is that when we started thinking about this problem domain, we got to it because we felt the pain on our own. And before Salto, in Salto were 3 founders. I'm the CTO, and my 2 partners are the CEO and president. And before Salto, we had another company. It was a company called Ravello Systems, and it was a SaaS company. We started in 2012, 2011, sorry, very different domain. It was a virtual cloud provider. It was a virtualization company. We actually developed our own hypervisor. So some people are crazy enough to develop their own browser. Some people are crazy enough to develop their own hypervisor. So the interesting bit about Ravello is that it was a pure SaaS company, so it picked up very, very nicely and quickly. And we were using all the usual business applications to run a business, right? So Salesforce and NetSuite and Zendesk and Jira and Marketo, et cetera, et cetera. And the way that we were managing those business applications, honestly speaking, it was the least professional thing that we did in that company. It was the classical rely on consultant and do changes directly in production and lots of tribal knowledge. No one knows what's implemented where, etc. And then at some point, I remember it was basically a crisis because the business was picking up nicely and we had to do some changes. And at that point in time, we wanted to change the pricing scheme. And I was running engineering back then. I was the VP of engineering, and I had to size the project, right? So I knew what was going on the product side, etc. So I said, okay, it's a couple of months. Then I remember the VP of product management coming into my office and asked me, Gil, do you know what are the implications on Salesforce and NetSuite? And I said, no, I don't know anything about the systems, but probably there's some kind of implication on them. And we realized that, well, yeah, it's a big implication. And we had to reanalyze, and we started shifting internal resources from engineering and started taking ownership over these kind of changes and processes. So things got slightly better. And then we got acquired by Oracle in 2016. And one might imagine that, well, a company like Oracle, obviously a very established company, a business applications company as well, has got it figured out. So things became much more complicated in those areas after we got acquired because the complexity in the implementation of these systems is considerable. And we're lacking tooling and everything is manual. And all of a sudden we got a deja vu because it felt very similar to the way that companies were managing their IT infrastructure about 15 years earlier. I can see Tim nodding his head, but back then you would see an IT person would start his day with a box in his hand, a server, would go down to the basement. It was always in the basement, to the data center, put that server into a rack, pull out one of those nifty foldable keyboards, and start typing commands. Installing the server, configuring it, installing software, whatever. Very time-consuming, very error-prone and ad hoc. Basically, every server was a new snowflake, right? And the more advanced companies started using all kind of automation, but eventually it was the same process. So obviously, the demand for new servers, etc., kept on coming up. So companies and IT organizations dealt with it the way that they know, right? Red tape and bureaucracy. You get an SLA, 60 days for getting a new server. Similar to a company getting a NetSuite organization getting a requirement for a change, and say, okay, open that ticket and I'll look at it in 2 quarters. But the business is moving, right? So the more high-performing organizations back then, and started with companies like Etsy and Amazon and Netflix and Google. What these guys did, they started shifting responsibilities over those IT infrastructure assets to the product development organization, product engineering. And these guys are engineers. What they know how to do is develop software. So what they basically did, they started adopting that mindset that they had about the way that they were managing the software to the way that they were managing their IT infrastructure. So all of a sudden, that server wasn't defined by whatever is installed on it, right? It was defined by source code that sits in a source control repository like Git. Back then, it was maybe Subversion because we're slightly before Git really hit off. And all of a sudden, you could create a common language within your team. So you can actually review changes there and discuss it, and you can have versions. And if you need to install another server, it's basically applying that same setup, the same configuration to another server, etc. So these are early days of DevOps, and those areas started as automation software, if you remember Chef and Puppet and these kind of tools, and evolved into infrastructure as code, like Terraform, Pulumi, which is the de facto standard today of managing your infrastructure, right? But if we step back and look at it, and that's what we did back then when we realized that it makes no sense the way the companies are managing their business applications, they're the same problems, right? Very complicated, complex, distributed configuration, typically done directly in production, is not well documented, etc. And that's when we realized, well, we can have similar solutions to this problem. Just we need to make sure that we adopt and adapt those solutions so they would fit the line of thinking of developers and administrators of different business applications. And that was the realization that led to us starting Salto. And we are seeing, and it was interesting to see because, for example, in the NetSuite ecosystem, there are native tools, and we're seeing great organizations build their own pipelines, using SDF, and generally works good, right? SDF has some challenges associated with it, but all in all, it's a good software solution, right? For doing many things, and we're seeing successful organizations using it. We're seeing many successful organizations using Salto for that, for their CI/CD and DevOps versioning, comparing different NetSuite accounts, etc. organizations. Would probably make it a little bit easier, but we are seeing that the demand keeps on increasing. For example, we've been to SuiteWorld in the last couple of years. So last year, and we had this big DevOps for NetSuite, and it says it mentions source control, continuous integration, and deploy from sandbox to production, all these kind of nifty sentences spread over our booth. So last year, in 2022, most people who came to us were a little bit puzzled and said, DevOps for NetSuite, what do you mean? What is it? Can you do that? Okay, so we explained. But this year, 2023, most already know. What do we mean by DevOps for NetSuite? And I don't think it's just us educating the market. It's just people realizing that that's a better way to work. Being able to deploy automatically changes from your sandbox to your UAT. Being able to create a pull request and have your teammates review your changes and approve them. Being able to easily compare all the differences between your production and your sandbox. Most companies don't really realize how different these are. And then it's a crisis in one of two cases. The first one is when they refresh their sandbox and just deleted God knows how many things that someone developed there. And the second is when they develop something in a sandbox, test it, think that everything looks okay, deploy it to production, and realize that, oh man, we just tested it on an environment which is so different than what we have in production. Nothing really works. Now we need to fix it in production. So realizing that all of the things are really important for being able to move quickly, being able to release changes in a higher quality. Companies understand it's important now because, well, NetSuite it's a critical system, and we're working with many manufacturers. If NetSuite is down or logically down, that's a big problem. It is a really revenue impacting problem. So investing in the underlying infrastructure, which enables them to change it rapidly, to change it safely, is becoming a priority for these companies. And an interesting part is typically when I talk with a NetSuite developer, when I talk with a Salesforce developer, as human beings, we typically tend to be a little bit self-centered, right? We think that our problems are very unique. But in Salto, we have a unique position because we're talking with a Salesforce developer, but also with a NetSuite developer, and with an Okta admin, and with a Zendesk admin. And their day-to-day challenges are pretty much the same. They're all fighting with deploying from sandbox to production, all of them. Now, in some cases, you have better native mechanisms. Probably the ones that Salesforce provides are probably the best native mechanisms. After that, we can look at NetSuite. With Jira, Zendesk, and Okta, for example, there are no real native mechanism to move anything from sandbox to production.
You have nothing.
Mind-blowing, right? Okta, it's critical as a security system. But they're all dealing with that. Or how can we make sure that my colleague approves my change before I deploy it to production? How can I roll back a bad change? These are universal problems and as companies really use more and more and that many different IT and business applications, we need, as an industry, we need to have ready-made answers to these questions. We don't need to reinvent the wheel every time. Right. Okay, that's how I do that with NetSuite. That's how I do that with Salesforce. It makes no sense, right? So I think that we are seeing that realization in the market, and we're very happy to be there because it's very exciting times because companies, they use so many different business and IT applications right now. The numbers are in the hundreds, right? And exciting times to deal with that.
Tim, I'm going to kick it to you. I know you've got questions for Gil.
Yeah, I've got so many just after like I'm describing, how Salto came to be and what you're seeing. I think you kind of answered this one, but I was wondering, like, you provide solutions, obviously, for NetSuite, or we wouldn't be here on a NetSuite related podcast, but you also support Salesforce and Zendesk and Jira and Okta, and I think there's more. I think the question I had, and I think you kind of answered it, is like, out of all those platforms that you now support, which one was the easiest to kind of build a solution for, and which one was the hardest? Sounds like Salesforce was maybe the easiest because it had some tooling already there. But what are your thoughts on that? And like, Are you
So
seeing that whenever you decide you're going to go after a new platform or a new business system, is it like, how do you decide if you can even support it
oh,
at all?
that's a great question, by the way, and I can talk about this for a very long time. So counterintuitively, Salesforce was not the easiest because it's right that there are some like APIs, native ways of doing things, but the overall complexity, what's going on the Salesforce side is it far exceeds every other platform. And the number of edge cases and special features and God knows what is really mind-blowing there. For us, eventually, if there's an API, if there's a way for a machine to read the configuration from an account and to write the configuration to an account, we can support it. And over those past few years, we've evolved our tooling of doing that. And right now, we're working on ways to shorten that time for us to support another application dramatically. Now, one of the things that I haven't mentioned, but Salto at its core, we're an open source company. So the core technology of Salto, including that infrastructure and those adapters that connect us to the different business applications, that's open source code. You can all find it on GitHub. And I think that if I look at the last really major adapter that we developed, which was Okta, we're seeing that given proper APIs, it's not a huge lift for us to support a new application anymore. And that's due to a combination of infrastructure that we built to build these new adapters, and the fact that almost all of the smarts in Salto, it's in our core. It's in our core. It's not in the way that we connect with those business applications. And that's because the way that Salto works is that we have created a standardized language, which we call NACL, NACL, which basically enables us to describe the configuration of any business application. So once we connect to an application, we use its APIs and we auto-generate all of those NACL files. So for example, for NetSuite, you would have NACL files for all of your custom forms and others forms and saved searches and all of your files in the file cabinet, etc. So that's the native Salto representation of that configuration. Now, everything that Salto does is on top of those files. So we can compare between NACL files and do it semantically also. So we understand the differences between accounts. We can deploy from NACL files to an account. We version control them using Git. We track changes to them, etc. So all of the smarts are on that layer, meaning that once we support a new application, so it's meaning building that adapter, tying those APIs, we get all of the values of the infrastructure out of the box. And that's because of the, for example, higher complexity of Salesforce and NetSuite in some cases. In some cases, when we go to simpler applications, let's say Zendesk, it's a relatively simpler application. It feels like it's almost like we're killing a fly with a cannon, right? Because we have really extensive capabilities, and Zendesk can be simple, for example. But if I go to the original question, so I would say that Salesforce is actually, I would rate them as Salesforce and NetSuite as the more complicated ones. Salesforce, because of the sheer size of the platform and all of the different intrinsities, different like complexities there. NetSuite, because it's the APIs are not, or the way to interact with the configuration is not as clean and straightforward as like the standard RESTful APIs or something like that. The way that Salto works is that we utilize SDF as well as a custom suite app that we built. in order to complement some gaps that SDF cannot do. For example, we can delete stuff in customizations that can be impossible to do with SDF, or we can access all the files in the file cabinet, and we do some interesting things with account-specific values in order to elevate some paints around them, etc. So it's relatively complicated. With the other ones, let's say Jira, Zendesk, and Okta, these are more standard RESTful APIs, and the size of the platform is more controlled, so these were easier.
Interesting. I have a follow-up question. I think it's somewhat similar. Well, two, really. One is when it comes to the businesses that are currently using Salto, is there a particular size or type of business that you're seeing that are like are more interested in Salto than others? You know, is there like, if it's a small business that's running on NetSuite, and I don't even know what small would be, but are they less likely to be involved in it, or is it the businesses that are going crazy with the customizations? So that's the first question. The second one is, when you do have a business that sort of buys into Salto, say they bought into it for NetSuite initially, are you seeing a lot of businesses that are saying, oh, wow, like now we've got NetSuite, I see you do Salesforce. Yeah, are you seeing that, like a lot of that adoption across multiple platforms?
Yeah, great question. So on the first question, on the type of customers that we're seeing, it changes per business application. But in general, once that business application is very centric to the way a company is working, and for example, they have an internal team that is in charge of that application, typically Salto is a good fit. If it's just like a hobby for a part-time administrator, not really. Once there's a team behind it, yeah. And we're seeing it across all kind of different industry segments. For example, with NetSuite, in tech, in manufacturing, we have with NetSuite a very big oil and gas company. With the other applications, I'm very like also household names, like lots of food and beverage companies, like the larger ones, pharmaceuticals, again, lots of tech, transportation. We're seeing across retail, quite a bit of retail also. And for example, retail, that's easier to explain. So they might have a very large support operation. That support operation relies, for example, on Zendesk. They have thousands of support reps, meaning that they need to optimize their Zendesk configuration in order to have an efficient operation. They can't really have downtime, so they have to use sandboxes, etc. Using Salto is a no-brainer for these kind of companies. So that was on the type of companies. Now, we are seeing, and these are the customers that typically are the most exciting for us, that they are using Salto for multiple different applications. And I think that one of our customers is already using us for 4 different applications. And it's one of 2 cases. It's either to start with a single application, and as they see that it's great, they expand to additional ones, or that they originally come with an intent to standardize and change the way that their business applications or IT applications, organizations work. We have some of those as well that started at the gate with 2 or 3 different applications. Because eventually for a VP of business applications or a CIO, that's a way to force and enforce standard processes for the way that his organization is performing change management to that configuration. And that's a way for them to have their vision implemented. We also have some customers that it is important for them from a compliance standpoint to have a standardized process. with paper trails, for example, in Git, that can be tied to an approval flow in Jira, etc. So we're seeing those as well.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. You know, it's compliance is one thing. I'm also curious about companies that are, and I see a lot of them, you know, like they're buying into NetSuite because if they're going to be acquired or shoot for going public, you know, being on the NetSuite platform obviously looks good. And I would imagine that having just the trail and the information available via Salto, that's
Yeah.
got to help. Are you seeing that as part of people doing due diligence where they're gone back and looking at Git to see, you know, who's doing what?
Yeah, we're seeing that we have some customers that actually have Salto as part of their audit flow with their auditor.
Yeah.
Eventually, Salto, we're not a compliance solution, right? We do not deal with a segregation of duties and all of those really fun things that you need to do for compliance. But we do enable our customers to build a well-defined change management process with gates, with approval gates in it. And that's crucial to some parts of compliance. You would usually need to complement it with like a segregation of duties solution or something like that, specifically in the NetSuite context. With some of the other applications, you don't necessarily need to do that.
Eric, I feel like I'm taking over to asking too many questions. I could go on, but
Yeah,
I'll let you ask.
it's okay. Yeah, I do want to take us into like the NetSuite specific, maybe a little more technical side. I know it was pretty early, right? Salesforce and then NetSuite pretty quickly after that. But what would you say the major takeaways were from adding NetSuite as a connector? What did you learn from that process? What did you bring? What did you take from that into the other connectors or into the platform itself? You learned from the NetSuite process.
Good question. Great question. So there were many learnings both on the business side as well as on the technical side. Let's focus on the technical side. That's probably more interesting to this crowd. One of the things that we realized is that companies tend to accumulate in huge layers of technical debt in their business applications configurations. And some of our customers, they have like a 15 years old NetSuite instance, and they have so much junk in it. If you look at the number of, I don't know, saved searches that they have there, or like stuff flying around their file cabinet, or we had customers that have more roles in NetSuite than the number of employees that they have. How did they got to that? I don't know. But or having thousands of workflows implemented in NetSuite. So one of the things that, first of all, it made us realize that the scale of the configuration that we need to manage here is very, very high, and that we need to enable our customers to manage their technical debt, to be able to clean up some things, or at least focus on the things that they really care about. So that was one of the learnings that we had with NetSuite. It's also applicable to some of the other applications, but I think that with NetSuite, we saw some extreme cases of technical debt. Also, it's common with NetSuite, and I think many of our learnings were there, is that you can see many hybrid developer and administrator teams within a NetSuite users. And they had a pain of how can we make the process more DevOps, developer-oriented, but how to be inclusive to the administrators that might feel out of depth when dealing with a Git, for example, or dealing with a textual representation of of everything, because they know how, I don't know, a transaction form looks like, not how the XML for a transaction form looks like. And for that, for example, in Salto, we added many features around visualizing that code in a way that feels much nicer to an admin, as well as visualizing diffs and creating a very simple integration with Git, etc. So the admins could be inclusive. That was another learning. And the third one is a learning which is reality that I typically dislike, but that's reality. And that many companies use release processes which are actually, they know are bad practices. I'll give you one of the examples for that is cherry picking features from your UAT to production. So the way that it works, they develop a bunch of different features in their, let's say, developer sandbox. They deploy all of them to UAT, they test, and then they would like to deploy to production just some of them. Now, in a software developer world, like in a software world, I would tell them that no, you don't do that, because you're going to,
Please.
yeah, don't do that, because you're going to deploy something that was tested on a very different environment. But with many of our customers, that's the business requirement, because otherwise they can't operate. So we had to add some features to enable that, to be able to really cherry pick semantically those changes and bundle them together to a single deployment, etc. All in all, I think that we are seeing a tension in the NetSuite space, also with Salesforce in many cases, between the desire to work correctly and lots of, some would blame it on the business, some would blame it on that's the way you do it with NetSuite, that basically makes you fall back to do out of order deployments and do some changes directly in production. Obviously, these happen. And we added features for that, for example, alerting on changes done directly in production, like out of band change detection. So I think these were probably some of the more interesting learnings coming from NetSuite. And as I mentioned, the cool thing is that once we learn those, the solutions are applied across all different applications. Because, well, also Zendesk admins can deploy things out of order for some reason.
Sure. On that note, a little bit on sort of adopting, I suppose, the maturation process of streamlining your deployments, let's say. We have a question here from Gopi. What's the percentage of NetSuite customers that maybe you're seeing who are already using some sort of CI/CD or automation in their process? And how easy is it? And what's the onboarding process like for companies who are doing nothing? How quickly, how easily can they adopt some sort of automation process?
Sure. So I'm not sure if I can, if I know like a number, 10% of the NetSuite accounts in the world are using a CI/CD. I can definitely say that when I talk with the larger NetSuite customers, the more advanced ones, they're either practicing CI/CD or trying to get them. Now, there's always an asterisk over what are they really trying to manage with their CI/CD. Sometimes it's just their SuiteScript, sometimes it's entire customization. These are very different challenges in terms of dependencies and being inclusive to non-developers, etc. So there's a variety there. Now, typically, when we start working with an account, we use like a crawl, walk, run, sprint kind of approach. So typically we would start with, let's compare different environments and use non-Git, non-automated ways to deploy changes with Salto. Let's just make sure that you actually understand what is that you're deploying and that you have paper trails for that, etc. Then we would bring in Git mostly for approvals. So opening pull requests and approve those, and then deploy only when those are approved. And only then we would continue and go to CI/CD. So being able to ease into the technology. Also, when going into CI/CD, in some organizations, they would like to start with just SuiteScripts, which can be easier and provides value to the developers. And then we will add on the metadata customizations like forms and saved searches and roles, workflows, etc. just later on. So our most advanced customers are using CI/CD for everything, basically, across all different environments. And we also have customers on the other spectrum that are just using Salto for manual deployments between environments. And one of the teams that I'm most proud of in our company is our customer engineering team. And they're the team that goes and help with the implementation and methodologies of doing that. And in the beginning, we're very worried of how can we create this expertise in all of the different business applications? Because let's say Dan from the customer engineering team, we have 3 Dans on the customer engineering team. So we can't know which one I'm talking about. So Dan from the customer engineering team, on one day needs to help a customer deploy complex changes with NetSuite, on the other day with Salesforce, and the third day with Jira. So one of the things that we realized is, as I said earlier on, the intersection between those challenges is surprisingly high. And the specialization that he needs to understand NetSuite, right? He needs to understand what are the limitations of SDF, for example. He needs to understand what are account-specific values or some of the internals of saved searches. But that's the 20%. The 80% is around almost universal challenges with DevOps and business applications are around DevOps, best practices for CI/CD, for Git. So, and we're helping customers learn those. So that's our overall general implementation strategy, typically.
I'm curious about a really common complaint in the NetSuite space, at least, is that it's really hard to find people. You want to hire a NetSuite developer. It's hard to find someone who already knows NetSuite development that's not already very gainfully employed somewhere. So you've had to build a development team, a customer engineering team, and more supporting roles. How have you gone about building those teams that do have these specialized knowledge? Have you been training internally? Have you been hiring externally? How have you gone about building these teams?
Great question. It's almost exclusively internally. And our overall approach in all different departments is onboard very, very smart, talented people and task them with a challenge. For example, the team that developed the NetSuite adapter on our side, they didn't know NetSuite at all when we started. So it started with some research. We specifically for NetSuite, we worked a little bit with a consultant, but just to ask questions. We didn't want them to write anything because we understood from the get-go that this is going to be core to Salto. That's something that we need to be experts at, but we need to be able to go and talk with someone. So we use that in order to be able to create that initial knowledge. But now everything is internal, and except for very few people in the company that came with mostly Salesforce knowledge, which is also very easier to find out there than the other applications. Everything else was, they learned it internally, and just bring smart, curious engineers. And because when we started the company, I just dealt with this with Rami a few weeks ago. We didn't realize how deep is going to be the technology that we're going to build. Because behind the scenes, we created a language, so there's basically like a parser and a compiler, and the size of the configuration, as I mentioned, is surprisingly big, as sometimes insanely big, as in gigabytes of text that represent a single environment. So you actually need to have some very complicated caching environments there, because you can't even just load all of that representation into RAM in some cases. And we build graphs out of that representation, so we could iterate them, understand dependencies, and diff them. So the underlying technology is surprisingly very deep. And we could have done that just because of the talent that we onboarded from the very early days. And what makes them tick is solving complicated problems for our customers and translate those to whatever we need to do on the technical side. And then if part of that is understanding, I don't know, how to walk around account-specific values in NetSuite, it becomes an interesting research project. And we're seeing that it works for us. I think it would be more challenging, for example, if I'm just a company and I'm a typical NetSuite customer trying to hire my next admin or my next NetSuite developer. That's hard because the talent pool is not that big, and the horizon, the way where can you go to, where can you grow to, can be limited. Fortunately, we don't have those limits, right? Because we can grow anywhere. And I think that for NetSuite developers, a similar mindset can help, because exactly that kind of, let's build my browser, or how can we have a different querying language, or dashboarding capable. There are interesting things that we can do. We can think outside of the box of the usual like patterns of NetSuite developers.
Mhm.
And that over time, I think, would make it also more lucrative and would increase the talent pool. So I think it's also on us as a community to break out of those bounds and be able to make it a more robust, more expensive profession.
So I
Hear,
have a
hear.
couple of questions for you. Are there any business systems or platforms that you support that Salto doesn't use itself internally? Or would you, and if, I don't know, I guess as a follow-up, is the fact that for most of those applications that you already support, I'm assuming you use Salesforce and you use NetSuite. Does that make it easier? Are you kind of like dog fooding, but not quite?
Yeah, I'm a very big believer in dog fooding. So yeah, there are some systems that we use and we would love to have Salto support for them. If we're missing Salto support for some of the systems that we use internally. And I hope that we'll be able to get to them next year. The reason for that is that sometimes we use some systems that we love, but they're not that common in the market because we're using also some startups, etc. And then from a business perspective, it doesn't always make tons of sense to support them. But dog fooding is an extremely important concept. And so in Ravello, in our previous company, as I mentioned, we're basically a virtual cloud provider. And the first thing that we did was to have our entire CI/CD pipeline run only on top of Ravello. And what he did, basically created a copy of the entire Ravello system on top of it. And it's like this recursive kind of thing. And we actually called it like Matryoshka, like the Russian nesting dolls. And that matured the product so much, because every time there was an issue, it became an engineering problem immediately.
Yeah, you felt the pain.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So we're trying to do the same here in Salto. It's not as directly like correlated to engineering is stuck if the product is not working, because, for example, I don't know, the support system, it's a little bit more far away, but we're trying to do exactly the same. And it's driving part of our progress, because it provides you with very, very short feedback loops. And when we're looking at the next applications that we're going to support, that's actually, it goes both ways. It's if we support an application, in most cases, that would be our default for use internally. And also one of the ways for us to inform the list of applications that we use, because that we support, because there's value in that dog fooding. Yeah.
Interesting. I'm just curious, a somewhat technical question, but is there anything within the NetSuite environment that you can't get to that you want to?
I'm sure there are things like that, that there's absolutely no APIs whatsoever. And yeah, we're aware of some of those. So in the beginning, when we just used SDF, there were plenty of those. And then we added that suite up. I think we did like a year after we did just SDF support, and that closed most of the gaps. But still, there are things that we need to do on the NetSuite platform and on the NetSuite ecosystem. For example, on the NetSuite platform, just very recently, we released support for Suite Analytics. That's something that originally we did not support, and we added support to it right now. We're getting customers asking us to support Suite Commerce. Not really the platform, right? But we're next to the platform.
Yeah.
And because that's an area where there are no really great solutions for managing changes. And we continually evolve and add more and more capabilities for NetSuite and for the other applications.
Interesting. I feel like we could ask questions. There's more questions I have than we have time. I hope we can get you back on here at some point.
Yeah, of course.
I think we've got about 5 minutes left. So Eric, I'll let you run with it. And
yeah, you're doing my hosting job.
I've
Thanks.
been trying to keep an eye on the time, because like I've got so many questions.
I'm watching it too. I've got more, but you mentioned the Suite app. I think I want to wrap up with, do you have any advice or lessons learned from building and distributing a Suite app at scale for anyone out there who's looking to maybe start, looking to go down that road of building a Suite app? Any advice for the audience?
Yeah. So one part, the first part will be more on the business side. The SDN team is your friend in that. And you need to find a way to work well with NetSuite, and they will help you. And so that's the first thing that you need to figure out, is how to work well together with the SDN team on NetSuite. That part is important. Technical side, well, obviously use SDF to build your suite up. Make sure that you have a proper way to build and test, as you should, and eventually proper software engineering, right? The fact that it's running on the NetSuite platform is orthogonal to the fact that you need to properly design your software, that you need to follow the right patterns in the way that you design your code and your solutions, and then follow and use proper DevOps processes for that. So think about your build process in terms of branching strategies, and start simple, right? No need to design for, I don't know, for the Mars mission. So start simple with your branching strategy, have your CI/CD, your CI pipeline, start by running automated testing. For example, testing, unit testing in your suite app is important, but from my perspective, I've been managing and developing software now for the past 20-something years in all kinds of different domains, right? I was dealing with high-performance computing and with hypervisors and business applications and networking and storage, etc. The best practices, the principles are always the same, right? You're just following right software engineering practices, testing, proper release pipelines, etc. And I would try and start with the right infrastructure and fundamentals. And then it's all about proving the business, right? So for this, work with the SDN team, get some users, listen to your users, make sure that you have a way to understand what are they doing, and make sure to have those feedback loops with your customers and users. Typically in software, like in SaaS, we can look at it as a way to talk to them, as well as a way to have proper observability and analytics on what's going on. So I'm not sure if it's that helpful, but I guess the main thing is you're building a software product. So it's a suite app, so what? It's a software product. Treat it like that.
That's
Not
good
agree.
advice. I do have one last quick question for you. Are you still writing code yourself? You getting in there, getting your hands dirty, or are you just so far back now from that that
Not enough. Sometimes I do. In the past few months, I've been trying to use ChatGPT to help me, but or other, or like a Copilot, etc. But typically it would be more I do, but less of like product code, more on the we need to analyze lots of data. For example, one of the things that we did, we have an interesting pricing scheme at Salto. We price according to the complexity of the configuration that we manage. And for that, for example, I wrote quite a bit of code that analyzed lots of data that we had behind the scenes. So the pricing scheme would really make sense. So I did that, try to use ChatGPT. It's not the most intelligent being. And
Yet, right?
yeah.
now we
Sometimes I,
can
yeah.
now we can check that last box, talked about there was some mention of AI, because what would a podcast episode be these days without somebody bringing it up? So
Yeah, I agree. So by the way, today my go-to would still be Python, I think. I started as like a C++ developer, then lots of Java, some Python, some TypeScript, some Go, but I think Python is my go-to right now.
Still a language I've never written. Seen it, I've read it, but I've never written it myself.
I think it's probably the easiest one to pick up. For example, with the kids, etc. That's a great one to start with.
I can't wait to do that. All right. Well, I do want to wrap us up here. I think we are at our time, Gil. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us. The really final question, where can people find out more about you, about Salto, about what's going on in your world?
Yeah, of course. So typically at www.salto.io. With me, probably on LinkedIn is the easiest the easiest place. I'm just Gil Hoffer there. You can also find me on Twitter. I'm not that active on Twitter. And same goes with Salto on LinkedIn. We also have a very active YouTube channel with many different videos that show the product. And specifically for the NetSuite crowd, if you're unfamiliar, we're also behind Salto Leap for NetSuite, which is a community and a website with courses that try and teach about NetSuite, also a little bit about Salto. There's also a Slack channel behind it, so we can talk with each other and help each other. So for the NetSuite crowd, if you're unfamiliar with Salto Leap, that's also a great place to go.
You can find me there as well.
Yeah.
We'll have links. I think we're dropping links in the chat, and we'll have links in the show notes as well. I think that will bring this episode of SuiteScript Stories to a close. Thank you so much, Gil, for joining us. Tim,
Thank you for
thanks for being here as always.
Yeah, thanks for taking the time. I really hope we can get you back on. And
Yeah.
I would imagine if we do, we'll probably end that episode with yet another huge set of questions. But really, thanks for taking the time, and thanks for all you're doing for the NetSuite community. It's greatly appreciated. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
The recording will be up on YouTube and in the SuiteScript Stories podcast feed. And we do hope you join us next time for SuiteScript Stories. Thanks.